The bells sounded like something between mourning and habit, a long, low vibration that rolled across the mist curling above Christchurch Meadow, reaching me through the car window I'd neglected to close entirely. The rain had left its grey fingerprints on the glass. I let the choral evensong spill softly from the radio, boys' voices breaking, pure and imperfect. They reminded me of a photograph I'd once seen of Ely Cathedral taken from a distance, a silhouette dissolving in fog. One could almost believe sound had colour, and here it was, pale, hesitant, and fading too quickly. The newspaper lay folded on the passenger seat, faintly damp where my sleeve had brushed it. I'd been turning to the crossword, not the news, my morning ritual. The front page had the usual, some petty scandal, a photo of a politician in mid-denial, but in the inner pages, a small, almost apologetic column caught my eye. Sister Agnes, St. Hilda's Convent. Following a brief illness. No photograph, no mention of age, nothing but the date and a sentence so stripped of detail it felt deliberate. I'd seen that name before, in a different context entirely, though I could not at once recall where. There is a particular discomfort in knowing the mind has stored something and refuses, for the moment, to hand it over. The crossword was more obliging. 7 across. Silent witness? 3. I let the pencil hover, my eyes narrowing against the dim light. Not an easy one. The answer should have been obvious. Something taut and neat. The thought drifted away as I lit a cigarette, watching the smoke uncurl against the faint chill of morning. The bells went on tolling, less distinct now as the choir on the radio swelled. Somewhere between the tenor and the bass, the clue returned to me. Mute. The simplicity annoyed me. It felt too blunt, too eager to be solved. And yet there it was, unavoidable. Mute. The sort of answer that carried its own shadow. I stayed there longer than I should have, listening to the bells flatten into the damp air. A woman in a green coat crossed the meadow path, her umbrella tilted like a shield. A dog strained at the lead beside her, the sound of its paws muffled by the wet earth. Everything felt slightly unreal, as though I were already remembering it rather than living it. By the time I started the engine, the column about Sister Agnes had folded itself into a quiet corner of my mind. But it was the crossword that kept pressing at me. Silent witness, not only mute in the vocal sense, but in the sense of choosing not to speak. Withholding. And in Oxford I had learned withholding was more common than confession. At the lights near Folly Bridge the rain began again. No real downpour, just a soft scatter that made the road shimmer like old glass. I thought of the convent, of the high walls along Cowley Place, and of the peculiar smell inside such places, part candle wax, part damp stone, part something unnameable. It struck me. That brief illness was not a phrase nuns often died of, nor was death in such closed communities entirely free from intrigue. Somewhere in the back of my head I could hear the bells still. Only now they seemed slower, as if each toll were waiting for the next. And I wondered, without any real reason yet, if Sister Agnes had been the kind of woman who might have preferred silence over truth. Lewis drove with the deliberate caution of a man carrying porcelain in the boot. The road out towards the convent curved away from the city, the rain flattening to a thin veil that blurred the edges of the hedgerows. Somewhere in the distance a rook wheeled above a field, black against the pale sky. We passed the last row of shops, a bakery breathing out its warm scent into the morning damp. And soon the walls of St. Hilda's rose before us, tall and heavy with ivy. The kind of walls that are more than architecture, they are statements. Behind them, you imagine the air is quieter, the clock slower, the conversations far more careful. The Reverend Mother met us in the entrance hall, her habit immaculate, her expression that blend of courtesy and unspoken impatience I had encountered in deans, headmasters, and certain senior civil servants. She welcomed us without warmth, as if hospitality were an obligation rather than a vocation. We were led along a narrow corridor smelling faintly of polish and damp hymnals. The stone-flagged floor made Lewis's footsteps sound too loud. She spoke as we walked. Sister Agnes had been with them for more than 20 years, chiefly in charge of the library. Once, before she took her vows, she had been a classic scholar at Somerville. She had died of a heart attack, peacefully in her sleep, and would be buried in the convent grounds. A pause then, almost reluctantly. An anonymous letter had arrived 3 days before her death, It accused her of concealing grave sins from the past. The Reverend Mother did not care to speculate on its contents, which she described as ill-natured fiction. Her office door opened into a cold room with a crucifix on the far wall and a desk stripped of papers. She sat behind it, folding her hands in such a way that suggested both authority and an unwillingness to indulge unnecessary questions. She had already spoken to the police doctor, she told us. There was nothing further to be investigated, but I wanted to see the nuns' quarters. Sister Agnes had lived in a small cell on the upper floor, its window set deep into the wall, the glass warped enough to make the garden beyond seem like an oil painting left out in the rain. The bed was narrow, the single wardrobe almost empty. A small table held a lamp, a crucifix, and a copy of Ovid's Metamorphoses, the spine frayed, the margins filled with neat, faint pencil notes. It was the library ledger on the desk that drew me. Bound in dark leather, its pages were thick and yellowed, each entry in an elegant, sloping hand. Names, dates, titles, the rhythm of routine work. But one name, written perhaps 2 years ago, had been underlined twice in red. I traced it with a finger, feeling the faint impression in the paper. Lewis leaned over my shoulder, reading it aloud under his breath. I didn't answer. The Reverend Mother, who had followed us in silence, remarked that Sister Agnes was meticulous in her records. I asked who the name belonged to. She said she could not recall, and the words were accompanied by that studied stillness I have learned to recognize in people withholding something. We left the room without touching anything else. Back in the cloister, the air smelled of wet stone. The rain had resumed, tapping gently on the leaded panes. Somewhere beyond the garden wall a bell began to ring, not the great chimes of Oxford, but a smaller, more tentative sound, like a memory of a bell rather than the thing itself. As Lewis and I walked back towards the car, he asked if I thought the letter had killed her. I told him letters rarely kill outright. They do, however, open doors one had thought permanently closed. And once opened, they can be hard to shut again. The name in the ledger stayed with me. 2 neat red lines, silent but insistent. A mark like the answer to a clue you think you've solved, but which refuses to make sense until you see how the rest of the puzzle fits around it. The convent, once the door had closed behind us, seemed to fold in upon itself, a world in miniature, bound by the walls and the quiet. People moved lightly here, as though sound itself were rationed. Sister Helena was the first. She had a face one might call pretty if one were careless, but the eyes undid that impression, alert, cool, the sort that measured as much as they met. She claimed to have known Agnes before she took her vows, when they were both students. Her tone was almost indulgent, though not without a faint edge. She remembered her as a gifted scholar who preferred the company of books to people, and smiled in a way that suggested she considered that a failing. I asked when she had last spoken to her at length. She tilted her head, as if searching her memory, but the pause was a shade too long. Father Macklin was of a different order altogether, urbane, with the voice of a man accustomed to speaking to large rooms without raising it. He served as confessor to the sisters, though the frequency of his visits appeared to be a subject he preferred to leave vague. His eyes moved past mine a fraction too often, as if they were watching for someone else to enter. When I asked if he had heard of the letter, he made a small, dismissive movement with his hand, something between a blessing and a refusal. Anonymous accusations, he said, were almost always the product of bitterness, and bitterness was not worth entertaining. Dr. Elspeth Cray arrived that afternoon, a visitor from the university, her hair caught up in a knot that looked carelessly deliberate. She had been working in the convent library on a project about medieval marginalia, and her name was known to me from 1 or 2 academic quarrels conducted in the footnotes of journal articles. She spoke crisply, each word chosen with precision, and referred to Agnes as formidable. It was not entirely a compliment. Rivalry in scholarship, I have found, can carry a longer memory than love. I asked what she had been working on in her final visit. She smiled without showing teeth and told me it was nothing that would interest a policeman. Mr. Julian Carr, the antiquarian bookseller, had the smell of dust and vellum about him, even in the open air. His shop in Jericho was the kind one entered cautiously, fearing to disturb the piles that leaned like soft ruins against the walls. He produced, almost shyly, a photograph of Agnes taken when she could not have been more than 20. Bright-eyed, hair loose about her shoulders, the faintest hint of laughter in the mouth. He did not explain why he had kept it, only that she had been remarkable, and that he had once thought of asking her to work with him. He would not say why she hadn't. There was, in each of them, a kind of intimacy with her that went beyond the formal, not the shared recollections of acquaintances, but the weathered fragments of something once personal, perhaps even urgent, now buried under years of silence. It was as though they had all in different ways been in possession of a piece of her life, and none were quite ready to let it go. Lewis thought I was imagining it, that they were simply people brought together by proximity to a death. But I have found that in such small worlds, death does not arrive as an isolated event. It disturbs the soil, and things thought long covered begin to push their way to the surface. The rain had stopped when we stepped back into the garden. The walls, dark with moisture, pressed in around us. Somewhere unseen, a bird gave a short, solitary call, and then the air was empty again. I thought of the ledger, the underlined name, and the sense, faint but insistent, that all four of them knew more of it than they would allow themselves to say. The solicitor's office looked out onto St. Aldate's, the kind of view that tempts distraction, buses easing through the traffic, a student balancing a cello case, rain stippling the pavement into silver. Inside, the air was dry, and smelt faintly of carpet glue and an old gas fire. Mr. Ferris was not an untidy man, but his desk carried the clutter of someone who had learned to live with paper's slow drift. Neat piles leaning towards each other like discreet conspirators. He had been Sister Agnes's appointed executor, though he confessed the arrangement had been in place for years without ever requiring attention. Until now. It was, he said, a simple will. A few personal effects to be left with the convent, a request for a plain headstone, and, here he paused, the bequest of a rare 15th century psalter, illuminated and in remarkably fine condition, to an unnamed friend. No further description, no address, no indication whether the friend was living or dead. He placed the document on the desk between us, his finger resting on the line. I read it twice. The sum he mentioned, worth several £1,000s, was not inconsiderable. I asked if he had seen the book himself. He shook his head. The item was not among her effects at the convent. The Reverend Mother's reaction was more than surprise. Shock, yes, but with the quick reflex of denial layered over it. She insisted with a firmness that suggested both conviction and need that Sister Agnes had no possessions of value. Nuns did not. The very notion of a personal collection of that magnitude was to her faintly improper. And yet the will existed, and so, I presumed, did the psalter, at least until recently. I asked if she recalled any visitor who might have left such a thing in Agnes's care. She looked away then, as if the high windows of her study might provide an answer. None, she said, nor had the book been kept in the convent library. She knew every volume there down to the faded sermons and worm-holed breviaries. It left the obvious question. Why would a nun, bound to a life without possessions, include such a gift in her will? And why, in turn, was the object now absent? Lewis thought it possible she had exaggerated its worth, perhaps out of sentiment. But a 15th century psalter is not the sort of book one stumbles across in a charity shop between paperback romances. It is chosen, preserved, and coveted. It does not vanish without someone noticing, unless, of course, the notice is deliberate. In the convent garden, the light was fading early, the rain holding in a low grey ceiling above the cloisters. I thought of the ledger again, the underlined name, and of the faces of those who had known her beyond the formal boundaries of her vocation. Each of them, I suspected, would understand the worth of such a book, whether in money, scholarship, or sentiment, and each, I was beginning to think, had their own quiet definition of what constituted a rightful inheritance. Before we left, I asked to see her room again. The Reverend Mother allowed it, though I sensed her patience wearing thin. Nothing had changed. The narrow bed, the crucifix, the worn Ovid on the table. Only this time I opened the wardrobe. On the upper shelf, pushed towards the back, was a square of folded cloth. Not the psalter, but the kind of protective wrap one might use to keep a book safe from dust and light. Empty. I said nothing to Lewis as we left, only listened to the slow closing of the convent door behind us, a sound not unlike the shutting of a box whose contents you have yet to see. I'd seen Dr. Cray only briefly at the convent, but hers was not the sort of presence one forgot. There was a precision to her movements, the economy of a mind trained to conserve itself for matters of consequence. She lived in a narrow Georgian terrace near the river, the brass of the knocker dulled to the same colour as the door. Her study was everything I expected, piles of paper rising from the floor like neglected towers, bookshelves bowed under the weight of folios, and the smell, faint but persistent, of paper that had outlived its owner. She admitted, with the air of someone confessing to a minor vice, that she had been working in the convent library until quite recently, a project on monastic archives, specifically liturgical texts of the 15th century. Then, without warning, her permission to continue had been withdrawn. It had been Sister Agnes's decision, she said. And no, she was not pleased. Her explanation was simple enough, a disagreement over the translation of a Latin verse in an antiphonary. But in the academic world, such simplicity rarely survives examination. Back in Agnes's cell, I found proof of it, a small stack of letters bound together with black cotton at the back of her desk drawer. The handwriting was Cray's, narrow, upright, deliberate. The tone began with polite formality, but with each exchange the language sharpened, the compliments thinning to a brittle edge. The verse in question was, on the surface, nothing remarkable. A line from the Gospel of Matthew used in the liturgy for the dead. Cray insisted on rendering it one way, Agnes another. The difference was subtle enough to be meaningless to most, but here it had acquired the gravity of a personal affront. One letter, more heavily pressed into the paper than the others, accused Agnes of obscuring meaning to preserve authority. It was the kind of sentence that could ignite a quiet war between scholars. It was tempting to imagine the Psalter at the centre of this quarrel. An illuminated text from the period, kept privately by Agnes, might have contained the disputed verse, and thus the authority to decide it. In that light, the bequest in her will began to look less like a generous gift, and more like the final stroke in an academic duel. And yet, inside one envelope was a slip of paper, smaller than a visiting card, bearing in a cramped, almost hurried hand the words, Beati qui lugent, blessed are those who mourn. The ink was darker than the letters usual, as though written with a different pen, or at a different time, and it was misquoted, the tense wrong, the sense slightly skewed. I turned it over. Nothing. The phrase could, of course, have been appointed barb, the sort of biblical needle academics sometimes favoured when civility collapsed. But there was something in its plainness, stripped of context, that felt outside the bounds of scholarly rivalry. When I asked Dr. Cray about it later, she looked almost amused. She recalled no such note, no such misquotation. Her gaze lingered on me a fraction longer than necessary before she remarked that grief, like translation, often depended on what one chose to omit. Leaving her house, the rain had turned sharp, small needles stinging the skin. Down the street the river swelled against its banks, the water carrying with it the slow debris of the city. A branch, a torn scrap of paper, a green bottle. I thought again of the Psalter, and of how easily such a thing could be passed from one hand to another in the name of friendship, or victory, or even pity. And I thought, too, of the note, blessed are those who mourn, a comfort, or a warning. It was not yet clear which. Julian Carr received me in the dim back room of his shop, where the smell of paper was so dense it felt almost liquid. Light from the narrow window fell in pale ribbons across stacks of folios, the air disturbed only by the faint ticking of a clock buried somewhere under the weight of centuries. He did not seem surprised to see me. Perhaps he had been expecting this conversation since we last met. Over a pot of tea served in cups that had lost their glaze, he admitted, with an almost theatrical reluctance, that he had known Sister Agnes before her vows. In those days, she was Margaret Lacey, a rising don at Somerville with a formidable grasp of Latin and a way of making it sound like a living tongue. They had been engaged, briefly. A photograph in his possession, the same one he had shown me before, had been taken on a trip to Venice. She stood on a stone bridge, her hair lifted by the breeze, smiling at someone just out of frame. Carr said the engagement ended abruptly, though he could not, or would not, be specific. The tone suggested both hurt and resignation, like a man rereading an old letter he still could not decide whether to burn. When I asked if he had seen her recently, he shook his head. Not for years, he said, and certainly not since she had taken her vows. His voice was smooth enough, but it slid over the words too quickly, like a skater crossing thin ice. Later, at the convent, the visitor log told a different story. There it was, Carr's name, written in a hand that tried to disguise itself but failed in the loop of the final R. The date was 2 days before Sister Agnes's death. When I put it to him, he did not deny it. His explanation was ready, too ready. He had been delivering a book order for the convent library. No, not to see her, not for any private reason, just business. I asked what the title was. He hesitated, the sort of pause that can be measured in heartbeats rather than seconds, then said it was a reprint of Bede's Ecclesiastical History. It was a clumsy lie. The convent already held 2 copies, one of them the 1900 Oxford edition, in better condition than anything Carr could have supplied. I let the moment stretch, watching the way his fingers tightened on the handle of his teacup. Why lie about a title? If it was something rare, something valuable, perhaps he feared the implication. Or perhaps the book was not for the library at all. In my experience, the simplest way to smuggle something in or out of a place that catalogues every possession is to hide it in plain sight, inside another book. Carr changed the subject, asking after the weather in that manner people employ when they know the conversation is about to turn unpleasant. I left him in the half-light of his shop, bent again over his desk as if to immerse himself in the safety of catalogues and valuations. Outside, the late afternoon was fading into that narrow band of twilight where shop windows begin to glow and the streets smell faintly of rain. I stood for a moment under the awning, thinking of the Psalter, a book small enough to be carried under one's arm, wrapped in paper, its weight unremarkable unless you knew what it was. Carr had lied about something, that much was certain. Whether the lie concerned the Psalter or Sister Agnes or both, I could not yet say. But lies, in my experience, rarely stay where they are put. They have a way of shifting under the light, showing their edges, and his, I suspected, was beginning to fray. It was Lewis, of course, who found it. He had been left in the convent library while I spoke to the Reverend Mother, leafing, rather aimlessly I suspect, through the register of holdings. The room smelt of old paper and candle wax, the damp in the walls seeping in despite the radiator's slow ticking. When I returned, he was at one of the long oak tables, a thick quarto open in front of him, his brow furrowed in a way that meant either puzzlement or boredom. "Look at this," he said, turning the book towards me. The pages were vellum, the ink browned by centuries. A Psalter, though not the missing one. This was a more battered survivor, its gilt long since dulled. At the outer edge of several pages, faint as breath, were notes in a neat but hurried hand. It took a moment to recognize it as Agnes's. I had seen her handwriting before in the ledger, the same steady slope, the same restraint. But these marks were not commentary in the scholarly sense. They were single letters, placed in the margins at irregular intervals, sometimes beside a verse, sometimes adrift in a blank space. I looked more closely, tracing them down the page. The first letters of each note, read vertically, formed a word. Novit. Latin. She knows. Once seen, it could not be unseen. The word appeared again, pages later, and again, as if woven into the text. Always in her hand, always with the same peculiar deliberation, as though she had no intention of it being read by chance. We found others. A missal, a collection of sermons, even a book of hours whose illumination was crudely overpainted from an earlier age. In each, the same quiet intrusion, Novit. Sometimes in capitals, sometimes in the flowing minuscule of a more practised script, but always hers, and in the later books the spacing tightened, the strokes darker, as if urgency had overtaken caution. Lewis, who has no Latin beyond the police motto, asked what it meant. She knows, I told him. The words sounded heavier in English, more personal. Not knows in the general sense, but something particular, something guarded. It was not a scholar's marginalia, No gloss, no cross-references, no notes on the text itself. This was not the work of someone annotating for study. It was a message, but a message to whom? To herself, perhaps, though that seemed unlikely. One does not usually write such reminders in the margins of books centuries old unless one expects someone else to find them. Why hide it here? The convent kept meticulous track of its holdings, but the margins of a medieval text are not easily searched, and even less easily explained to those unfamiliar with the language. It was the perfect concealment, in plain sight, yet invisible to most eyes. The more I considered it, the more the repetition troubled me. Not just that she knew something, but that she wanted that fact recorded again and again, in places it might one day be discovered. The persistence of it felt almost like desperation. Lewis suggested it might have been meant for one of the scholars who frequented the library, someone who would eventually stumble upon it. But scholars are trained to see the text, not the margins. I doubted even Doctor. Cray would have noticed unless she had been looking for it. We left the library with the light thinning in the cloisters, the faint echo of our footsteps trapped under the vaulted roof. The books remained behind, their pages closed, the messages folded back into the shadows. In the car, Lewis asked what I thought she knew. I said nothing for a while, watching the road ahead, the lamps just beginning to bloom in the wet. It might have been knowledge of the Psalter or of the letter, or of something entirely apart from either. But what struck me most was that she had not written, "I know." She had written, "She knows," as if the knowledge were not hers alone, but part of a story in which she was both witness and messenger, and perhaps, if the urgency was any measure, running out of time to be either. The chapel at St. Hilda's was a narrow vault of stone and shadow, its air redolent of beeswax and old wood. Father Macklin sat near the altar, hands folded, his eyes fixed on the worn brass cross. The faint clink of Morse's shoes against the flagstones drew no greeting. Lewis, standing just behind, looked at the priest the way a man looks at an animal caught in a snare. "You wish to speak privately," Morse began, his voice dry but pitched low enough to match the chapel's hush. Father Macklin's lips twitched, not a smile, more the ghost of a grimace. "I do not wish to, but perhaps I must." He did not invite Morse to sit, but Morse lowered himself into a pew regardless, hands on knees. He had the manner of a man prepared to listen longer than anyone wanted to talk. "It concerns Sister Agnes," Macklin began, his voice carefully modulated, as if shaping each word from brittle glass. "Shortly before her death, she came to me. She was troubled, agitated in a way I had not seen before." "Spiritual doubts?" "Not her own." Macklin glanced toward the crucifix. "She wished to break the seal of confession." Morse raised an eyebrow. "That is not done lightly." "It is not done at all. But she claimed she had learned, indirectly, of a grave crime. She had heard it from another who had heard it in turn. A second-hand confession, if you like. She believed she could speak of it without breaching her vows." Lewis frowned. "And what was this crime?" The priest's eyes closed for a moment. "She would not tell me in plain terms, only that the one truly guilty would never confess themselves." There was a silence. Morse's gaze wandered to the organ loft, dim in the far end of the chapel. A single note seemed to hang in his head, the unresolved hum of something unsaid. "She feared for her soul," Macklin went on, "yet more, I think, for another's. She spoke of hidden things that could no longer be hidden. And then—" He spread his hands helplessly. "She left. I did not see her again." Morse leaned forward slightly. "And you told no one?" "I am telling you now, Inspector, though I cannot and will not tell you the name of the penitent, if, indeed, it was a penitent at all." Morse considered this, his gaze narrowing. He had never been an especially pious man, but he understood the rules of the game, and the curious human ingenuity used to skirt them. On the walk back across the convent garden, Lewis broke the silence first. She wanted to reveal something, but couldn't, so she tried to find another way. Morse murmured. He took out the folded crossword from his pocket, tapping the clue he had filled in earlier that morning. Silent witness? 3. None. The answer, he thought, was less of a joke than he had considered at the time. The wind caught a few early autumn leaves, spinning them across the gravel path. Morse stopped, staring toward the convent library's high windows. Somewhere behind them lay the ledger with the double underlined name. Somewhere in those shelves, perhaps, the Psalter, and whatever truth Agnes had tried to smuggle into the margins. She knew something, Morse said softly, and she was afraid, not for herself, but for someone else. That's a dangerous sort of fear, Lewis. It makes people inventive. Lewis glanced at him. Inventive how? Morse's expression was unreadable. By finding ways to speak, without saying a word. They walked on, the chapel bell striking the hour, each note a little off-key. It was Lewis, uncharacteristically hesitant, who brought the thing to Morse. He placed the photograph down on the table in the station's small interview room, as if unsure whether it belonged there. "I thought you ought to see this, sir. It's the original, from Carr's Shop Morse." Halfway through a tepid cup of tea that already looked like something from a bad childhood memory, slid the photograph closer. The girl, no, the young woman, was unmistakable. Margaret Lacey, years before the black veil and the name of Sister Agnes. Her face, even then, had a stillness about it that Morse recognized from the convent's cloister, the expression of someone measuring her words before speaking. Beside her stood a man in clerical dress, a Roman collar, the faint stoop of one used to leaning over lecterns or confessionals. Not Macklin, younger, broad-browed, and possessed of that look some priests have, as though they carry both the world's burdens and their own private sorrows. But it was the background that caught Morse's eye. A boathouse, its wooden siding peeling, and above the doorway a small painted crest, a heraldic shield, quartered, with a chevron and 3 wheat sheaves. He knew it instantly. St. Athanasius College. "Where did Carr say he got this?" Morse asked. Lewis shifted. He didn't, not really. Said it had been in a box of old photographs for years, but there's no price tag on it. I think he kept it separate. Morse studied the image again. "And you found this before he told us he hadn't seen her in years?" Lewis nodded. The lie was clear enough. The real question was why. "Do you know the name Peter Rawlinson?" Morse asked suddenly. Lewis frowned. "Should I?" "A rowing blue, St. Athanasius, 1973. Died during the summer regatta. Fell from a punt after what was described at the time as a merry afternoon. Post-mortem said accidental drowning." Lewis waited. Morse was rarely this free with backstory unless it mattered. "The priest?" Morse tapped the photograph. "Father Gabriel Rawlinson, his older brother, chaplain at St. Athanasius for a few years before he was posted to a parish in Devon. Died there in 88, Lewis leaned over. And Sister Agnes, Margaret, was there when Peter drowned. More than that, I suspect." Morse pushed the photograph away as if it might infect the table. "You see, Lewis, the inquest was tidy. Too tidy. A tragic accident, the papers said, though there were mutterings about some academic scandal and a young woman leaving Oxford in disgrace shortly after. Now, what if Margaret Lacey had seen something, or knew something, that might have contradicted the official story?" Lewis's expression darkened. "And she kept it to herself all these years." "Until," Morse said softly, "someone reminded her." He stood, pacing to the window. Outside, the city was wrapped in a pale, late-afternoon haze, the spires blurred like candle flames seen through tears. "Carr lied about the last time he saw her," Morse continued. "The question is, was he trying to protect her, or protect himself? Or perhaps—" Morse trailed off, as if the next thought was too distasteful to voice. Lewis tried anyway. Or perhaps he thought she was going to tell someone about the drowning, and that someone was him. Morse's eyes were on the photograph again, but he didn't pick it up. "Find out," he said at last, "who took this photograph and why it was kept hidden until now. I want the rowing records, the college's visitor book for the week of Rawlinson's death, and, if you can manage it without getting us barred for life, a look at the chaplain's old sermons." Lewis raised an eyebrow. "Sermons?" Morse allowed himself the faintest smile. You'd be surprised what confessions people make when Morse sat at his desk, the evening light turning the rain-streaked window into a blurred watercolour of the city, the Psalter, the marginalia, the photograph. All of it had the feel of a half-finished puzzle whose missing pieces were buried in another lifetime. The story came together in his mind with the slow inevitability of a lock turning. It began in the summer of 1962 in one of Oxford's quieter backwaters, a college boathouse, the river sluggish with heat and the annual coxless fours race. A student, James Parry, had fallen into the water and not resurfaced. Officially, it was a tragic accident, misadventure in the coroner's clipped phrase. Yet whispers had persisted. The photograph Lewis had unearthed told a different story. Agnes, then Margaret Lacey, stood beside a man in a Roman collar, his hair wind-ruffled, his expression caught between youth and authority. In the background, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for, was the crest of St. Cuthbert's College, a silver cross on a field of blue. St. Cuthbert's had always kept its scandals well laundered. Lewis leaned over the desk now, hands in pockets. "You're saying she was there when the lad drowned?" Morse nodded. She was a junior research fellow spending the summer cataloguing the college's library. She knew them, the whole rowing crew in fact, and more than that, she knew what happened after. Through interviews, patient needling, and a measure of guesswork, Morse had pieced it together. The death had been an accident, an oar catching, a moment of panic, a fall. But one of the crew, the stroke, had been drinking earlier that day. A whiff of alcohol in his system would have meant expulsion, the end of a promising clerical career. And so another had stepped forward. A man with a future worth protecting, Morse said. He took the blame in some small way. The inquest was vague, the papers blander still. But the whispers always stayed. Lewis frowned. Why would Agnes keep that to herself, for all these years? Because she took vows. Poverty, chastity, obedience, and silence when required. But she wasn't prepared to let the truth vanish entirely. Morse tapped the page in front of him, a photocopy of one of the marginal notes from the Psalter. She found a way to speak without speaking, a code woven into the book she handled. Novit. She knows. A breadcrumb trail, scattered through the library, perhaps in the hope that one day someone would care enough to follow it. Lewis studied the paper, shaking his head slowly. That's roundabout. It's also safe, Morse said. She could never have gone to the police, not without breaking her vows and betraying the confessional secrecy she believed in. But she could plant a seed, enough so that the truth might out one day. Outside, the bell of St. Michael's tolled the hour. The sound seemed to thicken the air in the room. Lewis asked, "And the man who took the blame, he's still alive?" "Yes," Morse said quietly. "Alive, respected, and quite accustomed to his comfortable life. But Agnes's death, I don't think it's coincidence. The past has a way of circling back." Lewis straightened. "You think she confronted him? Or perhaps she told the wrong person, a confidant, thinking they could bear it. The trouble with truths like this, Lewis, is that they make very poor travelling companions." The rain eased outside, leaving the streets slick and glistening under the lamps. Morse closed the file and reached for his coat. There was still one name on the list, one person who had been on that riverbank in '62 and who had, until now, remained nothing more than a shadow in the margins. As they left the station, Lewis glanced sideways. "Do you know who it is?" Morse gave a faint smile, though it never reached his eyes. "I know enough." The convent's refectory, usually filled with the faint clink of cutlery and the soft murmur of grace, was tonight a theatre of stillness. The Reverend Mother had granted Morse the room, though her expression suggested that whatever was about to unfold would be distasteful, if not profane. At one end of the long oak table sat Dr. Cray, pale but upright, her academic composure only slightly frayed. Next to her, Julian Carr toyed with his spectacles, as though polishing them might polish away the day's events. Father Macklin sat apart, his hands folded tightly, his eyes fixed on some middle distance only he could see. Lewis stood near the door, a silent but watchful presence. Morse began without ceremony. "False trails," he said, pacing slowly. "They have their uses. They give us shape, a sense of movement. But the best false trails are the ones that seem inevitable." He glanced at Dr. Cray. "Your quarrel with Sister Agnes, spirited, yes, and genuine. You believed she'd undermined your work. You believed she'd hidden the Salter out of spite. But that wasn't why she died. Cray stiffened but said nothing. Morse turned to Carr. And you, the fiancé who vanished. The man who came back, quietly, discreetly, to a convent where you claimed no ties. The visitor log placed you here, days before Agnes's death. You lied about the book. You brought, not because it contained poison, but because it contained a photograph. The photograph that placed Sister Agnes, then Margaret Lacey, at a riverbank in the summer of 1965, the day of the fatal fall. Carr's lips parted, but Morse raised a hand. I don't think you meant harm. You were trying to protect her even now. But the truth... He stopped, let the silence draw out, and turned to Father Macklin. It was you, a hot summer's evening, a quarrel on the riverbank, drink loosening your tongue and unsteadying your step. A shove, perhaps meant as a jest, or perhaps not. A splash, and then a head striking the prow of a moored punt. You panicked. Another took the blame, a student whose career would not survive scandal, but who had the means to disappear quietly. The college closed ranks, and you took holy orders, respectable, untouchable. Macklin's knuckles whitened. You've no proof. No proof the courts would take, Morse agreed softly. But Sister Agnes knew. She knew the truth from the start. The Salter in her will, that was her silent act of contrition. Not for herself, but for the dead boy's sister, who never knew why her brother's death was called an accident. That was her friend. Her gift, if you like. Morse's gaze hardened. And you couldn't allow it. You thought her coded marginalia, her sudden interest in breaking the seal of confession, meant she was ready to tell. So you brewed her tea yourself. An old-fashioned habit, I suppose. And you added something to it. Not much, just enough to still her heart before Compline. There was a long, taut pause. The Reverend Mother rose, her face pale but resolute. Father Macklin? The priest's shoulders sagged. For a moment he looked every bit the weary old cleric he had always played. But his eyes, when he met Morse's, held no contrition. I served God as best I could, he said, as if that explained anything. 2 constables entered quietly at Lewis's signal. As Macklin was led away, the Reverend Mother crossed herself. Carr sat with his head bowed, the light from the high windows casting the outline of the cross across his back. Dr. Cray stared at the grain of the table, her quarrel with Agnes suddenly small and sordid in comparison. Morse poured himself a glass of water from the jug at the table's end. It seemed suddenly inappropriate to want whiskey. Truth, he said to Lewis, almost to himself, is rarely pure and never simple. Wilde was right, though in this case, perhaps, it was never even simple enough to be pure. They left the refectory together, the echo of their footsteps following them out into the cloister, where the night air felt impossibly cold. The Salter changed hands in the small, formal ceremony that the convent preferred for such things. A plain wooden table in the Mother Superior's office, a brief blessing, the cracked leather cover resting on the polished oak, like a relic of some long-forgotten crusade. The dead boy's sister, hair now white, eyes unreadable, received it with the faintest of nods. No one mentioned what it truly was, an act of reparation smuggled through the decades. Morse said nothing. He didn't need to. Back in his flat, the evening settled in like a grey shawl. Rain stitched the glass with faint silver lines. He poured a measure of Glenfiddich into the one clean glass he could find and put on a recording of La Traviata. The soprano's voice rose thin and aching, trembling at the edge of collapse. He thought of Agnes, or Margaret Lacey, as she had been, pacing her cell in the days before her death. Would she, in the end, have forgiven Macklin? Time has a way of sanding down the rough edges of anger, though some wounds Morse knew only deepen. Perhaps she had been close, perhaps not. He imagined her pausing, tea cooling beside her, as the bells began their late afternoon peal. Did she know at that exact moment that Macklin had chosen the darker road? Or had she, until the last breath, expected him to take the honest one? The whiskey warmed his throat, but not his hands. He glanced across the room at his desk. The morning's crossword, the Times, 16 across, still blank. Silent witness, 3. Waited. None. He smiled without humour and let the pencil roll away. The bells of Oxford began again, not a triumphant peal, but something lower, more deliberate, like the toll for a matin service in an empty chapel. Herbert's words, half remembered from some distant tutorial, came to him. Truth never grows old. Agnes had known it. Macklin had known it too, though he had spent a lifetime pretending otherwise. The aria reached its final broken cadence. The soprano's last breath dissolved into the hiss of the record. Outside, the rain eased. The room smelled faintly of damp wool and whiskey. Morse sat without moving for a long while. Then he closed his eyes.